Good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my small, cold heart for coming out this evening. I know we're all very busy, but again, thanks very much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be speaking with you this evening about something that I like to talk about, Japaneseness, or the theory of Nihonjinron. As you may notice, and the MSCs less so, but you masters guys will know this by now, I'm blatantly not Japanese. However, my justification is I spent the vast majority of my career in Japan and spent my master's degree studying this very thing. So I feel like I have something to say. That being said, when you disagree with me, I'd love to talk about it in detail, and I promise I'll bore the pants off you. So I'll look forward to that. So the idea of what Japaneseness is something that you can ask any number of people. In my study, I started with the 4 people on the right there who I would not recommend reading. If you look into your own experiences, and I didn't open this up to the floor because last time I did this, the conversation quite quickly turned to stuff that's not appropriate for an MBA. But the things that people always mention are sushi, geisha, ninja, and samurai. And Japanese people love the fact that this is what the world thinks about them. What they don't want to do is talk about some of the other more awkward elements of the society, which is what I'd like to talk about on their behalf, using 2 very straightforward case studies. So I don't assume that either of you have heard of either of these 2 men. If you have, don't give it away. That's why I'm here. So first and foremost, this character here who looks terrified in the middle is a man by the name of Gomi Hiroki. Gomi in Japanese means rubbish, but his name doesn't mean rubbish, which is disappointing for the purposes of my story. You may have seen this chap. I'm not sure if you can see it properly, but you may have seen this chap earlier in someone else's presentation, but I'll try and shoehorn him into mine as well. So Gomi Hiroki was a photographer with Mainichi Shimbun, which is the 3rd biggest newspaper in Japan. In 2003, Japan, despite not having an army, sent a self-defense force to Iraq to help with the reconstruction there. Gomi Hiroki was one of 13 people assigned to follow them around and take pictures. He was driving down the road one day and saw this, which is outlawed by the Geneva Convention, but it is a cluster bomb with spent bomblets, or spent ordnance, if you will, sat by the side of the road. He asked the driver what it was. The driver explained that it was spent ordnance, and he said, "That looks like a great souvenir. I'm going to take that back to Japan with me." So he picked up 2 of these bomblets, put them in his briefcase, and set off to Jordan. It's where his flight was going via Amman on the way back to Tokyo. As you can imagine, he's tired, he's stressed, he doesn't like the line of questioning in the Jordan immigration. So when the person asks to have a look in his suitcase, he throws a suitcase at the guy and storms off. The immigration agent opens the suitcase to see what's in there, and the bomb goes off. The man dies, and 3 policemen surrounding him are severely maimed and in hospital. So this is the story of Gomi Hiroki, 36-year-old man in Iraq, arriving there on behalf of his Mainichi Shimbun newspaper. And we're going to juxtapose his experience with this man, Koda Shosei. This man's the same age as me, so I won't tell you how old he was in 2005, but it was the same age as most of you now, awkwardly. He sets off from Japan as a young man to New Zealand to learn English, and arrives in New Zealand and is asked in one of his English classes, "What are your thoughts on the Iraq War?" And he says, "I have no thoughts on the Iraq War," and he's laughed out of the classroom. So he says, "You know what? I'm going to go to Iraq and find out what I need to know about the Iraq War." So he sets off from New Zealand, arrives in Amman, where everybody seems to go, and I recommend it highly for the 2nd time today. Lots of refugees there, you'll hear. Arrives in Jordan, and he talks to a couple of Japanese people there and says, "How can I get to Iraq?" And they say, "It's not how you can get to Iraq, but you should not go to Iraq." He arrives in the bus station in Baghdad with ripped jeans and $20 in his back pocket and asks where the nearest hostel is. The hostel says, you must be bananas, you're not allowed to stay in a hostel, you have to stay in a hotel with the required level of, of security, etc. Long story short, he is kidnapped by, at the time, Al-Qaeda. This is before the horrors of the Islamic State. He's kidnapped by Al-Qaeda, and he produces a hostage video, which you can see a still from here. In the middle, what you see is his parents. So these are his parents in Japan reading out a written statement apologizing for the actions of their son. They're not asking anybody to do anything. What they're saying is they apologize for their son bringing disrepute to the country of Japan in the international, in the eyes of the world. So I'm living in Japan at this time, and these two things happen. And I'm English or Canadian or half Japanese or whatever you want me to be, but I'm definitely not fully Japanese, born and raised with the Japanese mindset. So I look at these two stories and I think, okay, one of these guys is an idiot, the other one is naive, right? So which do we come down on from a UK perspective? We support naivety, right? The essence of youth. We're here to learn, we're here to experience, we're here to grow. We hammer down on people who don't think things through and affect other people with their actions. But what does Japan do? This is the story, this is what happened to Gomi Hiroki. Again, he's on behalf of the Mainichi newspaper. They arrive, the Mainichi newspaper executive board arrives in Jordan, and they apologize to the families of the people who were affected, and they pay restitution. He's pardoned. He's pardoned by the king after repeated petitioning by the Japanese government, because the Mainichi newspaper releases a press release saying, "We respect the local order and abide as much as possible by the rules imposed by the Allied forces." It's not insignificant to mention that Japan is a major investment partner of Jordan. He's quietly returned to Japan. One Japanese newspaper mentions the story, and he's quietly relieved of his position. Our friend, Koda Shosei, you might know by now which side my sympathies lie. The foreign minister at the time, first thing he says after hearing about Koda Shosei is, "I'm struggling to understand why this man would go on such a trip." The cabinet minister comes out, the chief cabinet secretary comes out with, "What bothers our minds as a government is why the kidnapped youth entered Iraq, taunting the danger. Iraq's conditions are clear, and everybody knows the Japanese people shouldn't go there. We need to check why this lesson hasn't been learned." This is while the man is still in the process of being kidnapped. Coincidentally, in the day they released this newspaper story, there's a poll in the same newspaper saying what percentage of Japanese people support the Japanese military in Iraq, and it's 63% want them to leave immediately. His family every day is called out in front of the cameras to apologize for what their son has done. They receive death threats. The father loses his job. The mother is institutionalized after having a nervous and mental breakdown. And again, the whole phrase that's repeated ad infinitum is, he's bringing Japan into disrepute. So what's the difference between these two people? Wow, you're very quiet. What's the difference between these two people, right? One is 24 years old, one's 36, right? One's young, one's not so young. Well, still a fine age, let me tell you. A fine age. Nothing wrong with being 36, but if you're going to be 36 or 24, perhaps 24 is a better option at this time. The 24-year-old, not only is he young, he's also acting as an individual, right? So he is, in Japanese parlance, he is soto, right? He is outside. He is on the outside of what they refer to in Japan as the tree. And the tree is Japan. And if you're part of the tree, you're allowed to exist. You're allowed to take part in cultural activities. You're allowed to be a representative of the country. But as soon as you step outside that tree, you are completely cut off. You are on your own. And in this case, we have a man showing up there, the naivety of youth shows up there outside of the Japanese construct, and as you'd imagine, is completely chopped off. What's the effect on these two men? Well, for Koda Shosei, he dies. Tragically, the video is still available on YouTube, and I'm not going to do it for you, obviously. But he has his head cut off, and it's streamed around the world. And his family, as I say, is completely and utterly destroyed. They have not had any success with anything since then, and it's still mentioned as the Haji of Japan, or the shame of Japan. What's the effects of Gomi? He killed a man. He killed a Jordanian airport worker who was just doing his job, and he maimed 3 others. What happened to Gomi? Nothing whatsoever. Where did the apologies take place? Kota Shosei in this video, in the video that, I'm not showing you, is weeping uncontrollably as he apologizes to Japan. The first thought is to apologize to Japan. Second thing is his parents apologizing to Japan. At no point is anybody saying, hang on, this is a 24-year-old, naive, don't get me wrong, ridiculous person, but still, the only person he's affecting is himself. And who does Gomi apologize to? He apologized to the Jordanian king. He says, I'm sorry for doing this in your country. And once again, not a comment to Japan, not anything else. So, in summation, I'm not saying this is right, I'm not saying this is wrong. I just think it's interesting to have a different perspective on what other cultures interpret as right and wrong. Because when we look at Japan, it's nice to think about sushi, it's nice to think about geisha, and it's nice to think about all these sakura and the autumn colors and everything else. But this is the reality. This is the interpretation that people have on everyday events that we would interpret in the complete opposite manner, or some of us would interpret in a complete opposite manner. And most importantly, who's Kota Shosei, right? The day he left Amman, he sat down with a Jordanian journalist there, and the Jordanian said, why on earth would you go there? Why do you want to go? And the journalist says, Kota talked about how the world could become peaceful. He wanted to get a first-hand feel of the war in order to think about peace. So maybe that's something that we can all think about as well. Maybe don't go to Iraq to find out about it. I recommend it as a terrible idea. But the idea that we have the opportunity to take time out in our lives to think about peace is something perhaps we can take away from this story. And when next time you go to Japan, keep in mind that these are 2 people who have been there before you. Thanks very much. All the best.